Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her with a calm precision that belied the rising storm beneath the surface of the room. Her fingers steady, her eyes momentarily downcast as the hush of the chamber thickened with anticipation. Not because of public curiosity but because those seated around the subcommittee table knew something unusual was about to unfold. This wasn't just another hearing, not anymore. Over the past week, tension had been building like pressure behind a dam, and today, it was bound to break. Nancy Mace, poised with a smile that seemed practiced, leaned forward slightly, a pen tapping the edge of her notebook like a metronome for a performance she had rehearsed countless times in the mirror. "You know, Representative Crockett," she began, her voice honeyed but edged with condescension, "some of us come prepared. We read. We ask real questions. We hold people accountable, not just play to social media." The comment slipped under procedural decorum but carried enough weight to turn heads and furrow brows across the room. Crockett didn't react immediately. She looked at Mace, then the chair, and back to her notes, the silence stretching just long enough to make the room wonder whether she'd let it pass. But across the table, Representative Carla Jennings gave a near imperceptible shake of her head, not out of disapproval, but as if to say, "Oh, not today." Even a few Republican aides shifted in their seats, feeling the subtle shift in atmosphere. The moderator cleared his throat. "Representative Crockett, do you wish to respond?" Still looking down, Crockett calmly pressed the red button on her mic. "Thank you, Mr. Chair," she said, then raised her eyes to meet Mace's with unwavering clarity. "I'd like to remind my colleague that just because someone speaks with confidence doesn't mean they speak with truth. And just because someone reads their lines well doesn't mean they did the work." It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional, it was perfectly controlled, like the opening move of a chess game she had already mapped out. But Mace, unwilling to let the narrative slip, responded with a tight-lipped smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said, her voice sugar-coated with mock sincerity. "I didn't realize holding people accountable was considered theatrical. Maybe I should take notes from your last press tour." The air went still. A cameraman muttered under his breath. Online, a clip was already circulating, labeled, "Nancy Mace throws shade on live TV," but what came next would overshadow every attempt at calculated performance. Crockett didn't blink. "Maybe you should," she replied evenly, "because when I speak for people who've been shut out of rooms like this for generations. And unlike some folks who just want to look like they care, I actually give a damn." The words landed like thunder. Representative Alan DuPont, a staunch conservative from Utah, sat back slowly, his face betraying the realization that this moment was going to live far beyond the walls of room 2141. The chair attempted to move on, to regain order, but the current had already pulled everyone out to deeper waters. Mace had come in confident, expecting to steal a headline, only to become one herself. And yet, this confrontation didn't start with the heat of an argument. It had been simmering quietly, far from the spotlight, for weeks. The committee, tasked with overseeing government contracts, was usually buried under the bureaucracy of dry reports and sleepy testimonies. But Crockett wasn't built for the background. Her team in Dallas had worked nights and weekends uncovering irregularities in a cybersecurity contract tied to Mace's district, awarded to a firm with no federal contracting experience and close ties to a campaign donor. Crockett never made direct accusations. She let her questions speak louder than outrage. That alone was enough to put Mace's team on high alert. Behind closed doors, they began briefing her on how to handle Crockett, framing it as a policy disagreement but preparing for war. 1 week before the hearing, during a private strategy session, Mace laughed. "She wants the camera." Let's see how she handles it when it's aimed back at her." Her aides chuckled, confident they could rattle a newcomer. But what they didn't understand was that Crockett didn't need to perform. She didn't need to posture. She had the truth, and that made her dangerous. Word of Mace's plan got back to Crockett. Her intern overheard a Republican aide boasting about the takedown being planned. When told, Crockett simply said, "They're coming with mirrors. I'm coming with receipts." The night before the hearing, she stayed late, annotating transcripts, reviewing documents, and speaking with her legal advisor in Fort Worth. Her chief of staff asked if she wanted to go softer this time. Crockett replied, "Soft doesn't survive in rooms where lies wear lipstick." She arrived the next morning in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back, glasses low on her nose, not for drama, but for readiness. The cameras didn't catch the brief eye roll when Mace greeted the room or the straight-ahead stare she gave when Crockett passed. Everything was already in motion. Mace leaned back in her chair as the hearing opened, letting a few beats of silence stretch too far before beginning her attack. "Representative Crockett," she said, voice smooth, "can you clarify whether you've read the full 342-page audit report or are you just referencing the summary that's been floating on Twitter?" A few scattered gasps and muffled chuckles fluttered across the chamber. The insult was buried in plausible politeness, Mace's signature style. Still, Crockett didn't respond. The silence grew heavier. Mace pressed again, flipping her binder. "Some of us put in the hours, you know, late nights, actual reading. The public deserves to know who's speaking from facts and who's just repeating sound bites." The camera panned to Crockett. No reaction. Then she moved, just slightly. She pushed her chair back, placed both palms on the table, and lifted her head slowly. "Miss Mace," she said, her voice low but sharp, "do you actually want a response, or are you just practicing your monologue for Newsmax?" A chill moved through the room. Even the stenographer paused. Mace's smile flickered. She hadn't expected humor or composure. But Crockett continued, "Because I did read the report. Twice. I highlighted every section on contract inflation and fraudulent billing. And if you'd bothered to read past the sections with your donor's name, you'd know I'm not here to waste time." The jab was elegant and exacting. Mace opened her mouth to retort, but Crockett didn't give her room. "And since we're pretending this is about policy," she added, her tone sharpening, "let's not forget the last time you tried to pass off a blog post as official source material. The committee struck it from the record. Remember that?" The chair shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene. Crockett leaned in slightly, dropping her voice so the room leaned with her. "Don't come at me with footnotes you haven't read. Don't dress up bias as transparency. And don't assume that because I'm newer, younger, or not at your wine and cheese circuit that I won't meet you line for line." For once, Mace had no reply. Crockett wasn't finished. The damage was only beginning. She let the silence stretch again, not awkward but strategic. She reached for the audit report. "Let me take a minute," she said softly, her voice a thread of steel. "Because I want to make sure I say this right." The room held its breath. "I'm not here to impress. I'm here because when someone's stealing money from your neighborhood, you don't stay quiet because the thief wears a tie." Mace shifted, uncomfortable now. Crockett raised the report. "This outlines 37 violations. Overpriced services, non-existent deliverables, invoices missing hours. This isn't a partisan issue. It's taxpayer theft. And some of the names on these pages?" She tapped the cover. "They're donors, longtime friends of yours, Miss Mace. So yes, I read it. And I know exactly what I'm talking about." Mace tried to cut in, but Crockett pressed forward. "You came here hoping to make me look foolish. Hoping for a headline. A viral moment. But what you forgot, what people like you always forget, is that some of us have to prepare twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. A breath caught in someone's throat. Crockett leaned forward. "Do you know what it feels like?" she asked, voice softer now, "to be judged before you speak? To be dismissed before they hear you? I do, every day, and yet I still show up prepared. I don't skim memos and hope charm will hide ignorance." Mace's binder was now shut, her smile gone. "Mr. Chair," Crockett said, turning back to the committee, "I'd like to submit sections 12 through 16 into the record. I also request an inquiry into vendor relationships flagged on pages 214 through 226. The room exhaled. This wasn't performance. This was preparation, weaponized. But outside the chamber, something else had already begun. Social media caught fire. A 30-second clip became a tidal wave of reaction. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. The caption, "She didn't stutter." Commentary erupted. Pundits praised. Critics reeled. A political commentator tweeted, "We just watched the moment Jasmine Crockett became a national figure." Back inside, Mace gathered her papers in silence. She didn't wait to be approached. She slipped out the side door. But Crockett stayed seated, flipping pages, circling figures, already thinking ahead. She wasn't chasing the moment. The moment had come to her. And she met it with facts, with poise, with a voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. And the world listened. That evening, the quiet corridors of Capitol Hill buzzed in an unusual way, not with the clamor of legislation or late-night negotiations, but with the echo of a moment that had caught fire far beyond the marble walls of room 2141. Staffers huddled around phones in break rooms, replaying clips of the confrontation. A junior aide from Arizona whispered to a colleague, "She didn't even raise her voice." The reply came instantly, "She didn't need to." And that was what stuck with people. Not just the content of what Jasmine Crockett had said, but how she said it. Calm, exact, measured like a seasoned litigator choosing each syllable as if it carried weight. Because for her, it did. Even the critics who had long dismissed her couldn't look away. Some tried to spin it, calling her sharp, aggressive, too rehearsed. But none could claim she had been dishonest, and that made their counter-narratives crumble fast. The clip was already in heavy rotation on MSNBC, spliced with past footage of Crockett questioning witnesses in courtroom hearings from her days back in Dallas. CNN dubbed it, "Composure Under Fire," while TikTok dubbed it with audio from classic movie speeches. Memes flooded timelines, and in every version, Mace was the one fumbling, scrambling, reduced from the orchestrator of a takedown to the symbol of a miscalculated misfire. But what made the story take root wasn't just the initial confrontation, it was the aftershock. In Mace's office, the mood was brittle. Her chief of staff, Ben Kirkland, stood by the coffee machine tapping furiously on his phone, muttering, "She went off script." He didn't mean Crockett, he meant Mace. The attack was supposed to be pointed, performative, safely within the bounds of plausible deniability. It was supposed to rattle Crockett just enough to disrupt her rhythm, not provoke a scalpel-sharp dissection of the very audit they had hoped no one would read past the executive summary. In that moment, it became clear, Crockett hadn't just read the report. She had internalized it, analyzed it, turned it into ammunition. And she hadn't fired wildly, she'd aimed with precision. Across the Capitol, in quieter offices and private group chats, the calculus began to shift. Members of Congress who had rarely acknowledged Crockett began forwarding the clip to their own staffers. A representative from Oregon sent a message to his chief aide, "Watch how she holds the line. That's how it's done." By the end of the day, Requests began to trickle in, first from junior lawmakers, then more senior ones, asking for meetings with Crockett. Some wanted to thank her. Others wanted help preparing for their own hearings. And while Crockett's public profile exploded, she stayed anchored. There was no press tour, no victory lap, just business as usual, committee prep, district calls, policy briefs. When asked by a reporter in the hallway if she was surprised by the reaction, she simply said, "I showed up prepared." That's all there is to it. And that, perhaps, was why it resonated so deeply. In a world of manufactured outrage and headline-chasing politics, she hadn't come for attention. She'd come to work. Meanwhile, back in South Carolina, local papers began asking questions about the cybersecurity firm tied to the disputed contract. Journalists pulled the same audit Crockett had cited and began connecting dots. Names that had once gone unnoticed now drew scrutiny. One article asked bluntly, why was a firm with no federal experience granted a multi-million-dollar contract in Representative Mace's district? The story that began as a viral video was becoming a potential ethics issue. Mace's office released a statement. It was bland, cautious, clearly crafted by lawyers. Representative Mace respects all her colleagues and remains committed to oversight and transparency. It didn't help. The comment section beneath the post turned brutal. Damage control. She got smoked. You tried it and you lost. Even some of her longtime supporters expressed unease. Not because she had sparred with a colleague. That was common. But because she had misjudged her opponent so badly. And that misjudgment carried consequences. She had underestimated not only Crockett's knowledge but her poise, her timing, her ability to command a moment without needing to dominate it. And now, that clip, those 5 minutes, had become a teaching tool. A law professor in Phoenix included it in a new module titled Composure and Conflict. Debate teams in high schools from Ohio to California were studying her pacing, her restraint, her rhetorical choices. A corporate seminar on leadership used the moment to illustrate the power of listening before responding. And through all of it, Crockett stayed quiet, not silent, just undistracted. Because she wasn't chasing legacy or sound bites. She was simply living what she had trained for. What people didn't see were the years behind the calm, the community meetings, the courtroom battles, the nights she spent in Dallas poring over case law in small offices where no cameras rolled. She hadn't learned grace under pressure in Congress. She'd brought it with her. During a Friday town hall in Garland, Texas, a woman in her 60s clasped Crockett's hand and said, "Thank you for saying it the way it needed to be said." Crockett smiled gently. "I just told the truth." The woman replied, "That's what made it matter." Back in D.C., the tone around her began to shift, not loudly, not publicly, but unmistakably. Colleagues who once overlooked her began weighing their words more carefully. A few apologized quietly, others asked to collaborate. Mace, on the other hand, grew quieter. Her next few committee appearances were uneventful, her questions cautious, her tone subdued. Her staff tried to keep things steady, but donors started asking sharper questions. Why hadn't she been briefed properly? Why go after someone with facts at their fingertips? Why hadn't she known what was in the audit? And beneath it all, the unspoken truth lingered. This wasn't just a bad day. It was a turning point. For Crockett, it was confirmation. For Mace, it was correction. And for the public, it was clarity. Because that hearing wasn't just political theater. It was a glimpse into what happens when someone shows up not with performance, but with proof. And the contrast couldn't be ignored. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't match insult for insult. She let the facts speak louder than anything else in the room. And in doing so, she shifted the center of gravity. not just of that hearing, but of a larger conversation about what power looks like when it's grounded in truth rather than volume. While the internet buzzed and media narratives twisted themselves into every imaginable shape, Jasmine Crockett remained unmoved, unbothered, and unshaken, continuing her work as if the ground hadn't shifted beneath every politician who watched that moment unfold in room 2141. She still read every memo, sat through every subcommittee briefing, and responded to constituents with the same diligence as before. But there was a new air around her, a quiet sense of gravity that followed her into rooms and preceded her name on agendas. She didn't strut, didn't gloat, because for her, none of this was about winning a moment. It was about making sure the truth had a seat at the table, even if it had to fight to stay there. But behind the scenes, the fallout from that 5-minute exchange was gathering momentum like a storm far from shore. Journalists who initially focused on Crockett's delivery began turning their attention toward the content she had laid bare. Reporters started digging into the vendor relationships flagged in the audit, and what they found didn't just validate her claims. It opened new questions, questions that led to investigative threads about contract inflation, shell corporations, and political donors with suspiciously timed payments. One particular exposé traced a web of influence that spanned across state lines, tying the cybersecurity firm to a series of questionable government deals in 3 other states, all linked by campaign donations and last-minute bid changes. Suddenly, what had seemed like a sharp moment of political theater now read like the prologue to a much larger story, and the name Jasmine Crockett kept appearing. Not as the firebrand or the disruptor, but as the one who pulled the curtain back. Meanwhile, Nancy Mace found herself in the middle of a mounting crisis. Her district office was fielding calls not just from voters, but from local reporters demanding answers. Her communications team scrambled to write and rewrite responses that sounded cooperative without conceding fault. In strategy meetings, her advisors debated how to spin the narrative. Was this a misunderstanding? A miscommunication? A media smear campaign? But nothing stuck, because unlike so many other political moments, this one had receipts. It had a paper trail. It had a protagonist who hadn't come to fight but had come prepared, and it showed. Mace's donors began to ask harder questions. Lobbyists who once saw her as a rising star now paused before attaching her name to projects. Even her allies in the Oversight Committee gave her a wider berth, unwilling to be caught in the blast radius of whatever might come next. And while Mace tried to regain her footing, Crockett moved forward. Her colleagues began to notice, not the viral fame, but the consistency. How she followed up, how she handled policy briefings with clarity and candor, how she stayed long after the cameras left to finish discussions, to ask more questions, to hold the line. She wasn't just prepared for hearings, she was living in them. She had trained for this, and now that people were finally watching, she wasn't about to waste the opportunity. But what surprised many, especially those who had underestimated her, was her restraint. She didn't tweet barbs. She didn't engage in back and forths. She didn't parade herself on talk shows or flood the internet with merch. She gave a single, brief statement across her channels. I showed up prepared. I told the truth. That's all there is to it. It wasn't just humility. It was a re-centering of the conversation. And people noticed. Teachers played the hearing in classrooms. Corporate leaders referenced it in team meetings. Even Sunday sermons in a few churches wove her words into lessons about dignity and justice. Not because Crockett had gone viral, but because she had done something increasingly rare in politics. She had stood her ground without making it about herself. And that, in the long run, had more staying power than any headline. Back inside Congress, the atmosphere had changed in small but telling ways. Hallway conversations quieted when she passed. Invitations to panels arrived with more regularity. Younger representatives, especially women and people of color, reached out to her, not for congratulations, but for mentorship. "How did you stay that calm?" one freshman congresswoman asked. Crockett replied, "I've had a lot of practice not being given the benefit of the doubt. Eventually, you learn how to carry the weight without letting it bend you." In a way, her presence became a standard, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. And the more she showed up with the same precision and grace, the more others adjusted around her. The metaphorical table didn't just expand, it tilted. Her moment had started with a confrontation, but her impact deepened through consistency. And for Nancy Mace, that was the hardest part. Because this wasn't a scandal she could deny or distract from. It wasn't a story she could outrun. It was a demonstration of credibility she couldn't replicate. In a party room meeting weeks after the hearing, one of her colleagues joked, "You tried to dunk and missed the rim." It wasn't malicious, it was observational, and she couldn't disagree. She had walked into that hearing believing she could control the script. What she learned was that control isn't something you assert in the moment. It's something you build before the moment comes. Crockett hadn't just responded well. She had arrived with a foundation so solid that no attack could knock her off balance. And that truth, plain, quiet, irrefutable, was now shifting the political landscape in ways no one had expected. By the third week, the clip had faded from trending lists, but it hadn't disappeared. Instead, it had become a point of reference, a case study, a conversation starter. It became the answer to questions like, what does accountability look like when it's not performative? And how do you lead when others are playing to the crowd? In small offices, in big classrooms, in living rooms and city halls, people were watching, not just the clip, but how she moved after it. And the most powerful part? She kept moving the same way she had before, head down, facts in hand, prepared for the next battle, not because she needed a win, but because she had a duty to the truth. What began as a 5-minute spar turned into a generational moment. A masterclass in restraint, evidence, and the quiet power of composure. And while Nancy Mace searched for new strategies and safer ground, Jasmine Crockett did what she'd always done. She showed up. Because in the end, the clip didn't define her. Her work did. And now, the world was finally catching up. By the time Congress resumed its usual rhythm, something unspoken had shifted not just within the committee rooms but across the broader culture of how political moments were weighed and remembered. The story of Jasmine Crockett dismantling Nancy Mace in real time wasn't just a viral sensation anymore. It had become institutional memory, a flashpoint in modern congressional history that refused to fade quietly into last week's noise. Inside briefing rooms, senior staffers began referencing the exchange as shorthand. Don't pull a Mace, a quiet warning against underestimating your opponent or walking into a confrontation without bulletproof preparation. Crockett, for her part, didn't need the reminders. She carried herself with the same intention she always had, alert, ready, respectful but never deferential to power that hadn't earned its place. What changed was the way people responded to her. She didn't have to introduce herself anymore. When she spoke, heads turned not out of curiosity but because people had come to expect that what she said would matter. On the other side, Nancy Mace found herself contending with a dilemma far more personal than political damage. Her confidence, once effortless in committee hearings, became calculated. Her tone, once casual and assertive, now hovered on the edge of hesitancy. She was present, but she wasn't the same. In conversations with her team, she admitted quietly that she hadn't seen it coming, not because she believed Crockett to be unprepared, but because she had assumed Crockett would play the same game. She hadn't. That, in essence, was the problem. Crockett didn't come to the hearing to perform. She came to reveal. She didn't play for optics. She operated with substance, and in a chamber full of people trained to posture, that was dangerous. Meanwhile, outside the Beltway, the public had not moved on. They had absorbed the moment into their vocabulary. It became metaphor and symbol, lesson and lightning rod. An 8th grade civics teacher in Michigan told her students, "This is how you debate with dignity." A pastor in Georgia wove Crockett's words into a sermon about speaking truth to power. A workplace leadership seminar in Chicago replayed the clip to explain how to manage confrontation without emotion clouding execution. Jasmine Crockett had not just spoken truth, she had modeled composure. Her delivery wasn't flashy, but it was unforgettable. And for many who had ever been dismissed, talked over, underestimated, or belittled, it struck a nerve. Because they saw themselves in her, not as heroes, not as politicians, but as people who had once been expected to stay silent. It wasn't the soundbite that stuck. It was the stillness, the way she paused, the way she let her facts do the cutting. The way she didn't let herself be baited into losing her ground. That was the difference, and slowly, her story began to outgrow even the original setting. She was invited to speak at universities, though she declined most of them. She received letters from students, lawyers, and even young Republicans who admitted, quietly, that they had misjudged her before that day. She read them all, responded to many, and filed some away for the days when the job got heavy. But she never once posted them online or made them part of her press run, because she didn't need to prove the moment. She had lived it. Back on Capitol Hill, whispers of an ethics review began circulating. The contracts referenced in the audit were now under official investigation, and though the outcome was still uncertain, the very fact that Crockett's call for inquiry had sparked a real response said everything about how far she had come. The same people who had once dismissed her as just another loud voice were now being forced to reckon with the fact that she hadn't been loud, she had been correct. And in politics, there's no greater discomfort than being caught wrong on the record while trying to be clever. For Mace, the political cost was subtle but corrosive. Donors began holding their contributions until further notice. Local news outlets kept the questions coming. Her staff, once brimming with confidence, now operated in triage mode. Every appearance, every soundbite, every tweet was reviewed for tone. Her team no longer talked about dominating a hearing. They talked about surviving one. And that's when the true scope of the shift became visible. Not in the press releases, not in the trending hashtags, but in the subtle recalibrations of posture, tone, and respect that Crockett now commanded. She hadn't won just the moment, she had raised the standard. And no one wanted to be on the wrong side of that standard again. In a rare interview weeks later, Crockett was asked if she would do anything differently about the hearing. She paused, smiled gently, and replied, "No. Because I said what I meant, and I meant what I said. The truth is still the truth." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The interviewer noted the calm in her voice, the ease with which she carried herself, and remarked off camera that it was hard to believe she was still considered a first-term representative. But Crockett wasn't interested in titles or optics. She was focused on the next hearing, the next contract, the next layer of accountability. And that's what made the impact so lasting. Because while others plotted moments, she was building momentum. The kind that couldn't be undone with a misquote or a smear campaign. The kind that comes from showing up prepared and letting your work echo longer than your words. What the world saw in that room wasn't just a confrontation, it was a confirmation. That the truth, spoken clearly and without apology, still had the power to shift a room, to change a narrative, to expose a system too comfortable with its own shadows. And as that truth settled, so did Jasmine Crockett, back into her work, back into the documents, back into the quiet grind of a job most people never see. But the country saw her that day, and they didn't forget. And so, in the weeks that followed, as Washington cycled through its usual chaos, new bills, old feuds, press conferences carefully staged to sound spontaneous, the echo of what had happened in room 2141 refused to vanish. It had embedded itself into the congressional bloodstream, not as scandal or spectacle, but as a new baseline. Jasmine Crockett had not just spoken up. She had redefined the expectation for what it meant to be prepared, to be principled, to be immovable in the face of premeditated doubt. She had stood her ground, not with theatrics, but with truth so sharp, it left no room for rebuttal. And outside those marble halls, the ripple effects were still expanding. In neighborhoods where politics often felt distant and rigged, people were talking. They were watching that clip not for entertainment, but for encouragement. Young activists, students, single mothers, lifelong voters who had never seen someone speak with that much calm authority without compromising who they were, now had a new kind of benchmark. Not a viral hero, but a living example. A woman who didn't ask for permission to be right. A woman who wasn't surprised by the attack, but absolutely ready for it. In coffee shops, on college campuses, even in church basements, the conversation became less about who won the exchange and more about what it revealed. That power built on illusion crumbles when confronted by someone who did the work. And Crockett had done the work. Every late night in her Dallas office, every case she read, every unanswered email she followed up on. It all led to that moment. Not because she was waiting for it, but because she knew eventually someone would try her. And when they did, they'd meet not the sound of protest, but the weight of documentation, conviction, and self-control. Meanwhile, Nancy Mace's office settled into quiet damage control. They scaled back public appearances. Their talking points softened. The tone of her social media posts grew more cautious, sometimes even regretful, though never directly. Her staff pivoted to emphasize legislation and constituent services, trying to recalibrate her image without drawing further attention to the now infamous exchange. But it was too late for silence to save her. Not because the moment was her worst, it wasn't, but because it had exposed the fragility of a strategy built on showmanship. She had assumed control came from the loudest voice. Crockett showed her that control is something you walk into a room carrying long before the mic turns red. On the House floor, members who once avoided Crockett's gaze now greeted her with guarded respect. Some even offered quiet congratulations in passing, not because they liked her politics, but because they had seen what preparedness looked like in its purest form. In a world where so many moments are manufactured, hers was real. And it reminded people what it felt like to witness substance in a place drowning in style. But Crockett didn't pivot to fame. She kept her calendar full of committee briefings, district calls, town halls that didn't make headlines. She returned to the grind like nothing had changed, because for her, it hadn't. She had always believed that the truth, clearly and calmly delivered, would outlast any performance. All that had changed was that now, everyone else believed it too. A month after the hearing, she received a handwritten letter from a retired judge in New Jersey. It read, "In my 42 years on the bench, I've seen a lot of performances. Yours wasn't one. Yours was a reminder. You reminded the system what integrity looks like." She didn't post the letter. She simply folded it, placed it in her desk drawer, and got back to work. Because for Crockett, That's where the story had always lived, not in the headlines or the applause, but in the next unanswered question, the next policy brief, the next fight to hold power accountable. And if there's anything that stayed with those who watched her that day, it was this: she didn't come to be remembered. She came to get the job done. The fact that she made history doing it, that was just a consequence of telling the truth when it mattered most. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Nancy Mace wasn't just about a courtroom-style takedown or a viral congressional moment. It was about the invisible hours that lead up to impact, the discipline to not flinch when provoked, and the wisdom to let facts carry the weight of your voice. It was about showing that dignity isn't weakness, and silence isn't submission. It's sometimes just the space you give the room before you fill it with something that can't be ignored. Crockett didn't win by shouting. She didn't win by attacking. She won by knowing more, caring more, and standing taller because she didn't have to raise her voice to prove she belonged. And for anyone who's ever walked into a room doubted, underestimated, or dismissed, that moment, her moment, will never stop echoing. Because truth, when spoken with that kind of poise, doesn't just land. It lives.